Well, it's such a pleasure and honor, General, to be here speaking with you and getting your perspective on leadership. I've spoken with prime ministers and I've spoken with CEOs, but I haven't spoken to anybody on leadership from the military perspective. Of course, you're now merged into civilian, but most of your career has been in the military, so it's going to be really interesting to get your take on leadership from this different perspective. Welcome, leaders, and those of you who want to become a leader in your own life. As the world becomes more complex and the velocity of change keeps increasing, true leadership requires resilience, presence, vision, a dynamic ability to adjust and change, and the self-awareness to create healthy environments and cultures for your constituency. I'm Dr. Stephen Sideroff, and this is Quantum Leadership Podcast, where we go beyond conventional wisdom to explore the powerful principles of the quantum effect, and that to maximize leadership's ability to connect mind, body, and organizational success. Welcome and thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks. It's great to be with you. And frankly, I think you're going to find that same leadership traits, attributes, qualities, and so forth that produce success in the civilian world are needed to do so in the military world as well. Yes, you can always fall back on your rank if all else fails. But if you find yourself doing that too often, I think you have to look yourself in the mirror and ask why that is.
Yeah.
Because generally, I think it's the same tactics, techniques, and procedures that succeed in the civilian world succeed in the military. Obviously, there are different contexts. Depends what unit you're in, what the task of that unit is in. Small units, especially airborne or rangers or what have you, often will have a certain ethos about them that is indeed different than the civilian world. The physical component of some of these can be very, very substantial. Uh, in fact, it's really an absolute requirement. You know, as they say, it's hard to lead from the rear of the formation, and you do need to lead from the front. But in so many respects, particularly as you become more senior, I think our conversation will bear out that the same approaches, same qualities, same attributes are necessary for success in the military that are necessary in the civilian world.
Well, I do have some specific questions around that and the distinctions later on, but I always like to begin with getting a little bit of your history. And General Petraeus, most of the time I'll ask people, when did you first consider yourself or think about becoming a leader? And you went to West Point. So, people who go to West Point already know that they want to be a leader. So I'm curious your early path and making that decision to attend West Point and seeing yourself as a leader early on in your life.
Well, first and foremost, West Point's only 7 miles from my hometown, the village just around Storm King Mountain from West Point. And I think a lot of what we do is because we admire people who are doing it, the so-called be like Mike. And for me, Mike was cadets at West Point, and I used to see them a fair amount because our sports teams in high school would periodically use the venues at West Point. In fact, our home ski slope for the high school ski team was the West Point ski slope. Beyond that, uh, at least half of the members of my newspaper route, half of the customers were either West Point graduates, staff and faculty at West Point, some other capacity that connected them to the U.S. Military Academy. And many of them played significant roles in my life. Our soccer coach in my high school period was coaching for $1 a year because he was a retired colonel who had actually taken the West Point team to the national championship some decades earlier, actually during the World War II period, as I recall. And again, he would connect us with the coach at West Point. In fact, three of us from my own high school went to West Point, including one of my soccer teammates, and we won the championship my senior year, which is obviously a big thrill. You know, it really is the personification of glory days that Bruce Springsteen sings about. An awful lot in my life connected us to West Point already. And because I had admiration for those who were there and those who had graduated from there and those who were on the staff and faculty there, I think it wasn't an inevitable decision, but it certainly was among the top options, I think, from a fairly middle school age, probably. And when
Well,
you
so
get there, obviously, it's again, exercise of leadership is one of the three major areas of development of individuals at West Point. You essentially, obviously, the academics are very substantial and very rigorous. The athletic component, whether you're playing intercollegiate sports, as I did 3 seasons a year, or some other kind of intramural athletics, you're going to do that. And so you put together athletics, academics, and leadership, and that's those are the three areas in which you are constantly evaluated. And I was really quietly proud to be one of the two members of my graduating class who was in the top 5% of the class academically. You have stars that you wear on the collar of your dress uniform. Was a varsity letterman. In fact, our ski team went to the Eastern Intercollegiate Athletic Championships each year. And then also was a cadet captain, and I was the assistant adjutant on the brigade staff. That's the top staff of the Corps of Cadets. And over time, you start to realize that you are pretty good at the areas of evaluation, and you start enjoying doing that as well. And people then asked, "Well, what kept you in?" Well, it was again, I felt privileged to be doing what I was doing. Again, I realized that I was really quite proficient in the different areas, and whether it was in the various schools or what have you. Ranger School, which is really a leadership course where they put you under enormous physical stress and also mental stress, and you're just exhausted much of the time. And in our days, you got one meal a day for the final week and a half or something like that. So they're trying to really heap it on you and then to see how you do under pressure. And I ended up winning all three of the awards in that particular course. And one of those was particularly gratifying because it's generally rare that the person who's also number one overall in the course is also gets this other award, part of which is peer ratings by your fellow Ranger students. And I got that as well. Because again, my view has always been that life is a competitive endeavor. You have to embrace that reality, and you need to compete and do your very, very best. Ideally, be the very best overall, but you also want to be the best team player that you can be, so that there's not a sense that you're crawling over the backs of, in this case, your fellow Ranger students to get to the top, but you're actually helping the others along the way as well.
I'm curious when you say that about interested in the other people as well, would you refer to that as an aspect of empathy?
I'm not sure I'd actually use that word. I guess it is as I think about it. It's just concern for your fellow, again, Ranger students, fellow soldiers. An awful, the why people enlist or sign up for the Army because they want to serve. And they're often animated by, again, overall missions. Our country has been attacked. I need to serve my country at its time of need and so forth. But they fight for each other. You're not thinking about, again, the American flag or motherhood and apple pie or anything else like that. You're thinking about, you're fiercely committed to not letting down the soldier on your right
Mhm.
and left. If it's in a ranger unit, that's your ranger buddy. It can be in a parachute unit, it's airborne buddy, or 101st Airborne Division air assault, it's your air assault buddy. But again, that's what really animates you. In fact, the bond in what's called the brotherhood of the close fight, those who have been in combat together on the front lines, engaged in some pretty tough moments, real tough firefights and operations, the
Mhm.
bonds among those individuals are just extraordinary. It's we often talk about the brotherhood, that brotherhood, and now of course it includes females as well because they're in all of our different branches also. But that community, that's the most elite fraternity in the world, I think. And again, the bonds are incredibly close. I often went back to reunions of the two units with which I served repetitive tours, the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division. They both shared, of course, in history that jumped into Normandy and Holland and some other pretty epic events in history. And when I'd go to these reunions, when these guys get back together, having served in World War II or Korea or Vietnam or whatever, you can see those bonds, and they're really quite extraordinary.
Mm, amazing, amazing, and you are kind of bringing together 2 aspects that you want to work together. One is being a competitive person and doing your best. On the other hand, wanting to bring other people along with you, wanting to find a way for all of you to have that success, not just you, is what I'm
Absolutely.
hearing.
Sure. No, absolutely. And of course, then as a leader, you are leading your unit to be as competitive as it can be, to be the very best it can be, ideally, again, the very best overall collectively, but doing that as well, being a good team player with other units. In fact, during the fight to Baghdad, when I was commanding the Great 101st Airborne Division Air Assault, uh, with over 250 helicopters, probably 20,000 or so troops, and so forth, I realized as we were making our way north that we were not going to serve the mission the best by doing what we wanted to do, which was conduct this massive air assault onto Baghdad International Airport. It would be our next rendezvous with destiny. There's a big phrase like that. It was authored by the first division commander of the 101st, who said the 101st Airborne Division has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny. And this is as it was preparing to deploy to World War II.
Mhm,
And so we wanted that next rendezvous to destiny to be this great air assault operation. And I realized somewhere along the way that, you know what we need to do is actually support the unit to our front. We'd already been doing that. Our Apache, we had 72 heavy attack helicopters, Apaches, that had been out in front of them, uh, taking out the enemy in the likely routes, the choke points, other locations that would have impeded them. Still plenty left for them to be sure, but and then also going after units that could affect them. So the long range rocket or artillery, even some of the air defense units and so forth that were all arrayed outside Baghdad, and could influence the battle because of the range of their weapon systems. So we'd already been doing this, and then the division commander called up at one point and he said, "Hey, I really hate to ask you for this, but do you have any extra 155 millimeter howitzer ammunition?" And I said, "Absolutely. Whatever you need is yours." In fact, I said, "I'll give you the whole unit with the weapons, the guns." Because the ammo is all uploaded on the guns. The fastest way to get it to you is to just shift the entire unit and all its soldiers to you. And we did that. I remember I asked, "Is there anything else I can do?" He said, "I know this is crazy, but you wouldn't happen to have an infantry battalion that I could have, would you?" I said, "Yep. Just tell me where you want them." And we air assaulted that unit actually onto the Baghdad International Airport because they had tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, but very few soldiers on the ground. And they were concerned that at night, enemy infantry might get in among them in some way. And we sent the entire battalion. It happened to be, in fact, the battalion that I had commanded when I was a lieutenant colonel a decade or more earlier. So again, I recognize that what we needed to do was to facilitate their advance. We actually took on almost a follow and support mission is the doctrinal term for it, where they'd been blowing by these major cities because they could get by with the tanks that they had. There was very little that could stop the M1 Abrams tank But the enemy was still in there, and they were astride our lines of communication. And we were very, very heavily dependent on those because that's how the trucks went back and forth all the way back to Kuwait. All the 5,000-gallon fuel tankers and the ammunition resupply trucks and all the rest of that. In fact, it took a couple days to turn around. That unit and all of us nearly went what's called black on fuel, which you're below half, and you're in perilous situation if they didn't show up. And here they reemerged a few days later. But the enemy could have interdicted those lines of communication that were hundreds of miles long. And so again, instead of focusing on preparation for what had hoped to do, which would have been historically very significant, again, air assault onto Baghdad International Airport, we decided we need to clean up these lines of communication, and actually made a recommendation to our collective boss, the Corps commander, that we need to go into these cities, not just sort of contain them. We need to clear them out so that the lines of communication will be secure. So again, I think that's the mindset that you have to have. You always want your unit to be absolutely as competitive and as it can be. In fact, as a battalion commander in that battalion that years later I would send to the Great Third Infantry Division mechanized when they needed it, and it played a decisive role, I should add, in the defense of the objective they'd taken at the airport. When I was commanding that battalion, we had such a robust program for Ranger School that we had 3 times the non-commissioned officer Ranger graduates of any other battalion, not just in the division, but in the Army outside of the Ranger Regiment at that time. And if you get to a certain number of Rangers in a unit, non-commissioned officer Rangers, the unit just starts to run itself. It's just such an important skill that is honed in the 8.5 tough weeks of that course. But that was many, and then any athletic endeavor. I mean, we won a vastly disproportionate number of overall post championships, and this is a post that probably had 40 or 50 other battalions on it. And I still to this day am chagrined that we only came in second in the chili cook-off at the Hopkinsville salutes for Campbell events. I thought we had a lock on it because we would get the tickets, the votes by giving free beer, but our free beer got shut down because it turned out that we were not the sponsor. I think Budweiser had sponsored it and we were giving Miller, or the other way around. But again, life is a competitive endeavor. You
Mhm.
do have to acknowledge that. You don't get a trophy just for showing up in the real world like little kids soccer. You get it for being the best. And that's what you should always strive to be. Remember telling the cadets at West Point after the first year in combat as a 2-star, having commanded the fight to Baghdad in the first year in Iraq, the 101st Airborne Division, I went back and spoke to them and I said, you all are a unique class. There's not been a class like this that is absolutely going to lead America's sons and daughters in combat. It's not a question of whether it'll happen. It's a question of when, because by now we're in Iraq as well as Afghanistan, and there's just no question that they're going to be in that position uh, sooner or later. And that became even more uh, likely as the buildup in Iraq continued. And I told them this is the ultimate privilege and responsibility, again, to lead America's sons and daughters in combat. And you should know that none of them wants to be led by somebody who is proud to be average. They want to be led by somebody who has done everything he can, if you're in a combat unit at that time, it was
Mhm.
only men, everything that he can to be the most proficient at the particular branch and particular tasks in which you're going to engage, because that gives them the greatest chance of coming home alive. So again, don't go in there uh, being too cool for school. Um, that will not impress them much. Go in and be the most aggressive leader you can in terms of learning everything you can so that they get the benefit of truly proficient and professional leadership.
Right. And, just to emphasize a couple of points in what you were saying, you were aggressive and you had an intention and a focus and a goal. But when you got new information, you were nimble. You were able to adapt, you were able to adjust and do something that you hadn't anticipated because you received new information that necessitated that. And I think that's really an important quality of leadership is that nimbleness, that's the ability to, on the one hand, hold a course that you want to take, but you are open to new information and using that and making adjustments based on the new information.
Well, you want to be a learning individual and you want to lead a learning organization. And there's ways that you do that. I was a voracious reader, a voracious consumer of information. And then when we would have recurring meetings, activities, and so forth, in some of these, every leader at the table had to give one lesson that he and his unit had learned and one initiative the unit was pursuing that would be of relevance to the others.
Great
We
practice.
also we also had lessons learned teams all over the battlefield: Army, Marine Corps, Special Operations,
Mm,
Asymmetric Warfare Group, Counterinsurgency Center, and all the rest of that. And so there's a whole process on my battle rhythm, my scheduled recurring events. There was 1 hour a month that I sat with the heads of these organizations in the theater, and they would share with me lessons they thought needed to be learned. But keep in mind that lesson is not learned when it's identified, it's learned when it's incorporated in the big ideas and the strategy, communicated throughout the breadth and depth of the organization, and then actually implemented. In fact, I developed for myself an intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership during the year or so that I was back in the United States after the 2 and 3 star tours in Iraq and before the 4 star tour. This is the same year that we did the counterinsurgency field manual, which was desperately needed. We had no intellectual foundation for the actual
mm,
kind of operation we were carrying out.
mhm,
And so this has 4 tasks. I just hinted at these. You have to get the big ideas right, have to craft the right strategy, you have to really understand the nature of the war in which you're engaged, the human terrain, the physical terrain, the neighbors, all the rest of it, how a country is supposed to operate and how it really operates. You have to communicate the big ideas effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization and to all who have a stake in the outcome of it. That's a pretty broad spectrum. It included, in my case, America's mothers and fathers who had entrusted their sons and daughters
mhm,
to us, to me. And they needed to understand a bit about me and what we were trying to do and how it was going. But of course, it also included the White House, number 10 Downing Street, the Pentagon, ministries of defense, and our Iraqi counterparts and the Iraqi prime minister and parliament and so forth. And then you have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. That's the third task. This is hiring the best and brightest. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the example, energy, and inspiration that you provide. It's the organizational uh, or architecture that you develop for the task. It's the metrics you use to determine whether you're winning or losing. And they have to have integrity and be very, very rigorous. And then it's how you spend your time. It's this battle rhythm I referred to earlier. What is the frequency of recurring events? What do you do every single day of the week? And we had that. There were certain morning activities at the start of each day, and it wasn't just each business day because it's a 7 day a week endeavor. And then what do we do several times a week? For example, we'd go after the morning updates. We'd get in a armored vehicle and drive downtown Baghdad, or a helicopter, go a little further, or a fixed wing aircraft and fly even farther than that to join a small unit and go on patrol with it and then experience a little bit for myself of what it is that they are doing and to get a sense of it for yourself as well. And then, once a week, actually, we had a video conference with President Bush. The ambassador and I did once a week. It was hugely powerful. Had the whole national security team around the table in the West Wing once a week. president actually did a video conference with Prime Minister Maliki, the Iraqi prime minister. I had one with the Secretary of Defense, the prime minister's National Security Council meeting. Again, the whole week is divvied up. And then also every other week or certain activities every month, all the 2 stars and above would gather together. Every quarter, the whole team, diplomatic, military, and folks would even come from the Pentagon and Central Command in London and Washington. And we'd do a 6-hour review and assessment of how we were doing.
Mm.
How was it going? And then make decisions out of that. So again, that's key. And on that battle rhythm, as I mentioned, there were activities that enable you to perform the fourth task of a strategic leader, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas as the situation evolves, as you achieve progress or experience setbacks, so that you can repeat the process again and again and again. And this construct's really important because it's a way of really looking at it, and it focuses you intently on the first task, which if you don't get right, the rest doesn't matter. And that is craft the right strategy, get the big ideas right. And that's not always been the case. I contend in the book Conflict, which I wrote with Andrew Roberts, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza, that it took us 13 years to get the big ideas right in Vietnam. And by then it was too late. The big ideas weren't right prior to the surge in Iraq. The surge that mattered most was not the extra forces, as helpful as they were in accelerating the execution of the new big ideas, but it was really the new big ideas that mattered most. It took us 7 years to get the right big ideas in Afghanistan, another year to get the inputs right. And then we started drawing down 6 months later, and the drawdown pace started to become more geared to what this situation was on the ground in Washington rather than on the ground in Afghanistan. So this construct really is, I think, pretty important because it focuses you so intently on the big ideas. It also reminds you what quality is most important in particularly a strategic leader or a senior leader, and that is strategic judgment, operational judgment, because that's what enables a leader to get the big ideas right. And of course, at every level this applies. The difference is that the leader at the very top is truly crafting the overarching big ideas within which everybody below is going to determine big ideas at his or her level, but within the constraints established by the overarching big idea. So if the commander in Vietnam is fighting a war of attrition in a big unit war uh, against North Vietnam and the insurgents in the south of Viet Cong, those below him are going to execute that, but at their level. They can't execute a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign if he is actually intent on, again, conducting a war of attrition, thrashing around the jungle, trying to find an elusive enemy, and then pile on with all the firepower that you can, even though that often created more enemies than it took off the battlefield. We should have been protecting the people, helping the South to secure the people in the villages, hamlets, districts, and provinces, and making the enemy come to us. We eventually recognized that that's what needed to be done, but by that time, in late 1968, after the Tet Offensive, the war had essentially been lost on the home front, and it was clear that we were going to have to draw down within some years of that.
The idea of the big idea is so central to your model of leadership, and you've identified a couple of times where we got it wrong, where Vietnam and then later on. What lessons were learned in those mistakes that may make it you and others more likely to get the right idea correct sooner and avoid mistakes? What
I'm
is
not
some
sure we always took the
guidelines?
right lessons, actually. In fact, my PhD dissertation at Princeton was the American military and the lessons of Vietnam. And my conclusion was I identified the lessons our leaders took, but I'm not at all confident that they were the right lessons. In fact, among them were let's never do this kind of war again, and let's make sure our forces actually, we're not going to focus on it at all. We had no counterinsurgency field manual when we were fighting two insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we were engaged in counterinsurgency operations and didn't even have a doctrinal field manual for it, much less training the units for it in the proper way, developing leaders to understand it, and so on.
Mhm.
So what I hope people take out of it, and then the subsequent assessment of it, again, including, for example, that it took 13 years to get the big ideas right in Vietnam. That's a pretty big failure for those who were executing the operations down at unit level. So, I hope that this construct also, which is we lay this out in the book Conflict in the introduction, and we use it as the prism through which we examine each of the wars, each of the conflicts
Mhm.
on which we focus in the course of the book.
Can you
Um,
identify some big lessons that make it more likely to get the big ideas right, or that you
well,
teach
yes,
during?
sure. Clausewitz cautions us the foremost, the paramount task of a leader in war, the leader in war, is to understand the nature of the war in which he is engaged and not to make it what he'd like it to be rather than what it really is. So we've had that caution through the years. And yet, again, the greatest strategic leader in Vietnam was not a French general nor an American general. It was actually the North Vietnamese general, General Giap. In fact, a book on which I'm now working is titled From Battlefield to High Command, and it's about the very small number of individuals who commanded on the battlefield at 2, 3 star level, and then became the overall commander, the strategic leader, commander of a theater of war, Europe, Pacific, actually the two different Pacific theaters, Italy, and so forth. And then were elevated and actually could carry out the duties at that level properly. Very, very few people, first of all, have actually had the privilege of doing that, but then have actually demonstrated what it takes to be a great commander of units in combat, in on the battlefield, and then elevated to the top, demonstrate the ability to exercise strategic leadership that is required.
Before you mentioned all the different meetings that you attend or have attended, all the different people involved in it. So it sounds like built into the system was really quite excellent communication between all the main players. Good communication as well as feedback. And those are
Yeah,
two
and you
quality.
want, yeah, and in fact, you want feedback. In fact, when I went back for the fourth tour, I took people with me that I knew were known to never leave something left unsaid, as it was said
Okay.
about H.R. McMaster. There was an intelligence colonel, military intelligence colonel, who had actually been sent home from Iraq in the first year because he believed that we were facing an insurgency. And that was not popular with the Pentagon at that time, so he had to be sent home. I brought him back with me. And I told him, your job is to tell me when you think I'm getting something wrong. H.R. McMaster, brilliant brigade commander during my 3 star tour in Iraq, every now and then would push back a bit, complained about losing one of his squadrons. He was an armored cavalry regiment commander, very, very substantial combat power in that particular formation. And the overall commander decided that he didn't need all the combat power. He took one of his squadrons before HR went off and did this masterful operation. But he made it known that he didn't like giving up that unit. So his post command tour, instead of being executive officer to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as I was, or executive officer to the chief of staff of the Army or Central Command commander, or one of these other very high visibility vantage point jobs, he was sent to the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. He wasn't even in uniform and wasn't even in the United States. So I brought him down to Iraq, had him do assessment after assessment. And in each case, there would be a forehead slapping moment as he laid out the latest assessment that he had done for the ambassador and for me, and he was always paired with an ambassador from the Foreign Service, just an extraordinary individual. And again, he did not leave something left unsaid. That's why I took him to Afghanistan when I went there as well. By then, he was a 1-star because I just happened to be, coincidentally, I'm sure, the president of the 1-star board, even though I was commanding the surge in Iraq, is the only board on which I ever sat. So you want this kind of individual, you want honest feedback, forthright. I would give the company commanders that I met with during these trips where I go on patrol with small units, and I'd get all the company commanders together. These are captains. They usually have had at least one, sometimes even two tours in combat before. They're the last level that knows every casualty by name, not face or number. And they feel rightly, keenly responsible for those entrusted to their care. And I'd give them my email address and I'd say, if you're ever really frustrated with your chain of command, not dealing with an issue that you send up, send it to me because this is too important. This is life or death. And, we'll try to shield you to the extent that we can. But I need to know about something if you are frustrated and not getting the issue addressed. So you got to have all these different sources of information. I actually welcomed having people come in from the States who would give another set of eyes. One of my big mentors, retired General Jack Keane, who had been the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, had been commander of the 101st Airborne Division as well when I was a battalion commander and then his chief of operations plans and training. I loved having him come out and would fly him all over the place. I'd give him an escort officer and he'd come back and give me what he saw. Lindsey Graham actually came on active duty something like 14 or 15 times during my 4-star commands, Iraq, Central Command, and Afghanistan. He was an Air Force Judge Advocate General officer, and I'd ask him to go out and look at something, and inevitably he'd come back and say, "Have you thought about this?" And we hadn't. He had a real knack for that kind of thing. I also wanted every inspector general unit and Army audit agency and anything else that could come out because we were also dealing with very substantial resources of all different types, including money. And I wanted everybody to feel that there was someone looking over their shoulder when it came to dealing with that. So again, I think you want as many folks. Now, at the end of the day, having heard from everyone, and by the way, generally getting the big ideas right is an iterative process that's best done as inclusively as possible. You want everybody to feel like they're inside the tent. But at a certain point in time, you do have to make decisions. But it's helpful still for everyone to feel that they have been heard at the very least, even if I don't agree with what it is that they have recommended or suggested.
And I'm hearing a number of leadership qualities in what you're saying. Everybody under the tent, people to feeling included in the process. But even though you're the one making that final decision, and so I'm assuming that this is one of the ways that you engendered trust in the people that were under you.
Well, certainly one of the ways that you do that. Again, another is you're out sharing a degree of risk and hardship with them. You're not on transmit. You actually listen. In fact, we had techniques for everything. We had routines, SOPs. So after the patrol, I'd gather the captains together, as I mentioned earlier, the company commanders. No, their commander was not in the room with them. I was the only one. My aide would be in there to take notes. It wasn't optional for them. Each one of them had to answer my questions. You'd go around the room, and usually it was something like, look, if all of a sudden resources become constrained, what's the one activity, the one initiative that we have to continue to do regardless? And then what's the new activity or initiative that you think we need to pursue? This is fairly standard. It's what's called one sustain and one improve. In other words, we must sustain this and we must improve in this other area. And they couldn't say me too. So they had to have multiple of these in mind as you'd go around, and you'd go around one way and then come back the other way. But again, you have methods for all of this. Again, SOPs, you have processes, and that's really important. And a lot of it also then comes together in the form of metrics, some of which I'd see every single day in the morning update. Certainly our casualties, enemy casualties, um, major events, suicide bombings, attacks, or car bombs, other significant actions in the course of the previous 24 hours and roll ups. And then some of them once a week would have the bridge report because the Al Qaeda and insurgents had blown up all the bridges in western and northern Iraq. We'd have Mr. Electricity would get up and here's the latest amount of megawatts that are on the grid. We had Mr. Oil. We had a slide that depicted many of the high tension wire towers had been blown down and literally on their side. These are the very substantial ones. These aren't just telephone poles. So we were tracking how we were coming with getting those back upright and secured and then restrung. I mean, there's myriad details.
Mhm.
I mean, we even had a swimming pool report for Baghdad at a point when security was very good and everything's going well. Then you could start to focus on what about the quality of life for the people, and there are many, many different
Mhm.
aspects that we tracked in that regard as well.
Mhm.
You know, how was the amusement park? There are actually multiple of them. What about the water park? Now, that said, when there was a big security event, we called it March Madness. So this is well about 14 months into the surge in Iraq. There was an uprising of the Shia militia that corresponded with an operation to destroy them in the southern city of Basra, second or third largest city in all of Iraq. I said, stop counting swimming pools. I actually happened to be at a division headquarters, and again, literally all hell's breaking loose throughout Baghdad and any of the other cities that had large Shia populations. And they wanted to brief me on swimming pools. I said, let's put that on hold for a period. We're back at war now. Tell me what we're going to do to deal with
Mhm.
this major challenge. I mean, this is a really serious issue. For example, the Green Zone, the seat of government of Baghdad, where our embassy was as well, and I was over there any day that I was not traveling outside Baghdad, co-located with the ambassador, so that we were always a team. But there were 12 to 15 volleys of 12 to 15 rounds of rockets uh, each during the day,
Mhm.
just getting hammered. And we had to get to the root of that, had to stop that, had to kill those, frankly, that were carrying out those attacks. And we did over time.
So, General, I'm really enjoying our conversation. There's so much to talk about. I'm realizing we're getting close to the end. I wanted to ask a couple of things. One, the title of this podcast is Quantum Leadership because we are looking to bring in some of the concepts of quantum, the quantum effect, to make power leadership much more powerful. And so a couple of those are the observer effect, in which the person doing the observing actually affects what's being observed. And I think you've been demonstrating that quite well. And then another one is entanglement, where, you know, particles can be so far apart, but they still act as if they're connected. And so a lot of our conversation today has been about interconnectedness and how important interconnectedness is in communication, and how important it is that everybody knows what everybody else is doing and
Yeah.
acts. And in the military, you have to act as a team, but that's a very important aspect of leadership and quantum leadership.
Among the ways in which I sought to achieve that was putting out my own counterinsurgency guidance. It was a
Mhm.
series of admonitions that were then explained, and I I did it myself. I would revise it about every 6 weeks or so and hit the send key, and it went to every single soldier, sailor, airman, marine, and civilian who was engaged in this particular endeavor.
Mhm.
So, I mean, the first one was secure and serve the people. We can only do this by living with them. In other words, we're going back downtown. That was the new big idea. Instead of clear and leave operations, we're going to do
Mhm.
clear, hold, build, transition. It was
Another way
promote
of establishing
reconciliation.
trust.
Yeah, with
Mhm.
the people though,
Right, right.
and then promote reconciliation. We cannot kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. We have to reconcile with as many of those who are reconcilable. We had a whole intelligence structure set up to determine essentially who was not reconcilable because they had to be captured or killed. And then it was pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly. It was promote greater civil military cooperation. There were some fun ones. There was walk, take off your sunglasses, engage the people. You can't do that separated from them by ballistic glass. Promote initiative, because this is a small unit war. Promote initiative. In the absence of guidance or orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. Um, be first with the truth in dealing with the press. Don't spin, don't put lipstick on pigs, just lay out what we understand at the time, update it as you get additional information, and try to beat the bad guys to the CNN Baghdad bureau chief so that we get the headline instead of the subheadline. Again, there's a whole series of these that I'd really thought through. And as I said, it went out again. The latest version would go out every 6 weeks or so with the latest tweaks to it.
Mhm.
There was a lot of that. I sent a letter to the troops generally before each of my returns to Washington for testimony. Some of it, frankly, was that I knew that what I sent out would end up in the hands of the press. And it was sort of a preview for them without me having actually provided it. So, all kinds of what we call tactics, techniques, and procedure for leadership. But a lot of them, are, again, they're captured in these four tasks.
Mhm.
And that battle rhythm is a very, very important part. We spent a lot of time actually determining how I could most effectively, efficiently, and productively use my time. And that
Mhm.
battle rhythm was very serious, and we stuck to it. Obviously, you got thrown off it occasionally as you had congressional delegations come through, or there are emergencies or sensational attacks or something like that to which you've got to give some considerable focus. But we worked very hard to ensure that we executed what was on that battle rhythm.
Well, these are all additional aspects of leadership that I'm appreciative of you sharing with us. I'm wondering, as a leader, General, what were your biggest struggles, difficulties, maybe miscues, and how did you handle them? I know in 1991 you were injured
Oh
and
yeah, I got
covered.
shot. I fractured my pelvis another time. That was really very, very serious and extraordinarily painful. I even had prostate cancer when I was the commander of Central Command. I alerted the Secretary of Defense and the president to it, didn't tell the press, and they never found out for years. I was getting radiation therapy every single day, weekday, for something like 8.5 weeks. Um, now there are lots of, and then, you make mistakes. People under you make mistakes. We had a soldier sergeant actually who used pages of the Quran for target practice we zeroed our weapons constantly. Zeroing means you're getting the round to go where it should go based on either your iron sights or a close combat optic. And so you have to zero these to the actual barrel where a round actually goes. A host nation worker, we had a number of those on our bases, found it. And, within 45 minutes, I was apologizing publicly on camera to the prime minister. So again, I mean, what you do in every case like this is you sit down, determine what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and then try to learn from it and then take actions to mitigate the risks of it happening or reducing the risks, at least, of it happening again, learning from it. And that's a crucial element of leadership as well. Again, the test of leadership is not when you spike the end ball in the end zone after a touchdown. The test of leadership is how you deal with adversity, how you deal with setbacks, how you deal with mistakes, and the rest of that. And there's inevitably, if you're a senior leader of an organization, there's going to be plenty of that. And again, you'll add to the list yourself as well. But you still have to keep driving on. You dust yourself off. You get back up, put the rucksack back up, and put one foot in front of the other.
And you don't be concerned about making a mistake because that can only distract you. You just handle them if and when they occur.
Well, obviously, you try to prevent them, and you
Right.
do that in all different ways, inculcating the right culture in your force, ensure they understand what it is they're engaged in, which is why I put out that guidance. Because again, it's all well and good to have big ideas at my level, but they have to actually be translated into real action by real soldiers under real body armor and Kevlar helmets and with weapons doing what only they can do, which is to engage the enemy and also to engage the people in a counterinsurgency in particular. So an understanding of that is crucial. And keep in mind that you achieve security with, again, weapons and presence and all the rest of that, but you solidify the security foundation by what you do to build on it, to get the people committed to sustaining what it is that we have achieved in their neighborhoods, which often included walls around them, gated communities, as we termed them. You know, I used to tell the people of Fallujah in particular that you have to spend a lot of money to live in a gated community in Florida, and here we are giving it to you for free. It was just a technique of once you clear a neighborhood, how to keep Al Qaeda or the insurgents out of it. Biometric ID card is the same thing. And again, these are small ideas that enable the successful execution of the overarching big ideas.
You mentioned culture. Did you do you consciously
Yes,
think about and guide?
yes, yes. A culture of learning. In fact, in the counterinsurgency field manual, I wrote the preface, I think it was. And among the points I made were that the side that learns the fastest in this kind of war typically prevails. So yes, you're very conscious of the culture, and in various, my very small units as a rifle platoon leader in an airborne unit or a company commander, what have you, you're trying to produce a culture. It's a culture of excellence, of competitiveness, of physically and mentally toughness, united, energetic, inspired, enthusiastic, all of these qualities. And you really do sit down and think about that. But above all is the culture of learning, because that's what you're constantly doing, whether you're training and conducting training exercises or in combat conducting military operations. You always have an after action review afterward to go over what took place, what went right, what went wrong, and how to improve the conduct of similar operations the next time we do them.
Well, General Petraeus, this has been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I really appreciate all of your words of wisdom here. And again, I want to thank you for joining me on Quantum Leadership Podcast. And, we're looking to raise the level of leadership, both in civic life as well as business life. So thank you for your contribution.
It's been a privilege, and I can assure you that the leadership construct applies wherever it is executed. It can be a nonprofit, for-profit military organization at war, but this captures what leaders have to do at all levels, and it's particularly important at the level of the strategic leader, the overall, the CEO, the founder, the commander.
Well, thank you again, General.
Privilege. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody, for joining me on this Quantum Leadership Podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think bigger, lead more authentically, and take steps toward meaningful change. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and make sure you subscribe and go to my website, drstephensideroff.com. Thank you again.